afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode number 95, and today Maggie and I are going to return to the discussion. We're going to return to discussing a different adaptation. We're going to do some analysis of this is a discussion we've wanted to have for a while, and we haven't been able to get around to it. But this was done at a suggestion of one of our Kickstarter backers.
Yeah, so one of the tier rewards for our Reward of the Rohirrim Kickstarter was to suggest a topic, and James Nonaman recommended Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He also recommended Rogue One, so 100% we're going to be doing both
I know.
of those, because we both saw that on the list, and we're like, ooh.
Right. Maggie's like, oh, come on, twist my arm, make
Try
me
and
talk
stop
about
me.
Rogue One.
I kind of want to do like an entire space class on Rogue One, because I just feel like it is such a perfect film. But anyway,
Yeah.
tonight we're talking about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the BBC and the Walden Media adaptations
Yes.
from the original text. So we thought we'd start with the original.
We'll start with the original
structure.
text. Yeah. So, and actually, so
Yeah.
this is particularly fun. So,
And start with the structure that you guys are familiar with. Like, we're going to start with openings.
We're gonna
and
start
then,
with
you know,
openings,
talk
yeah.
a little bit more broadly.
exactly. So, because and that's mostly for convenience, because there is so much to discuss, when you're trying to discuss the whole big picture. But also it enables us to really kind of dig in and look closely rather than just kind of making generalizations, which can sometimes get sloppy. Yeah, I will say one of the things that's really interesting. So this is okay, never mind. Let me not do preamble. Let's just look at the text. Let's look at the. So we're going to look at the opening. So the thing that jumps out at me most before I even put the text up here is that we're looking at the openings of the films, and if you watch the first 5 to 10 minutes, it's usually I think it's at least 7 minutes in each case. One of them was a little bit longer. You get from the opening credits through the arrival at Professor Kirk's house, and they're being like welcomed into Professor Kirk's house.
Welcomed.
Yeah, exactly. With varying degrees of welcoming. So I consider, as far as like the book is concerned, I consider the opening to be done when they're deciding what to do, and it's a rainy day, and like they're hoping to explore outside, but then they discover it's a rainy day and they have to do something else, which of course is what leads to the discovery of the wardrobe by Lucy in chapter 1. So again, that's the segment, which in the film takes 7 to 9 minutes, basically, getting to the point where they're upstairs in their room together, saying, what are we going to do? And then having it be a rainy day. The fascinating thing about this topic, about this comparison, is the text version of that is exactly 1 paragraph long.
Love it.
So here is the entirety of the analog to the first 7 to 9 minutes of both films. Once there were 4 children, whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivory, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair, which grew over most of his face as well, and on his head, as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. That's it. Now they're up there and they're talking to each other and they're planning their day, and we're transitioning. Right. Of course, the bit which gets expanded into almost the entire segments in the opening of the film is sentence 2 of this paragraph. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. Right.
Yep.
And that's it. I mean, in fact, I remember I first read this when I was 7. This was in the early 80s, and I hadn't the faintest idea what that was referring to. Like,
Oh, okay.
I mean, I kind of, that sentence went by really fast. I mean, it's short. He doesn't emphasize it. And I remember being 7 and that went 4 feet over my head. Right.
Yeah.
So like, to me, the story begins with they were sent to the house of an old professor. Right.
Right.
And I didn't fully understand why they were sent away and didn't have their parents. But I was like, I had no historical context for that whatsoever. And obviously, the imagining of the historical context is something that the films are very, very interested in creating, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a dramatic start. Like,
Yeah.
well, in the Walden media, I would say it's more dramatic. So do you want me to,
For sure.
let's just recap the opening. So
Yeah.
BBC opening just starts with a train.
The train platform. Yeah.
Train platform, stationary, not a ton of movement, not a lot of threat, pretty muted landscape and colors and everything, and it's the kids arriving off the train.
Yeah, we do see them getting on the train, right?
Yeah.
So we see like moms waving goodbye, though I was noticing like none of the moms seemed very upset, none of the kids seemed very upset.
Conversation
No,
either.
there's very little context. The only one piece of context I could tell, because I was thinking about this when I was watching it, is there's one shot where you can see a soldier also getting onto the train. So like, that's like the only kind of like wartime vibe that we get from that whole.
And you see their tags on their clothes, don't you? But I mean, again, only if you really know.
I would have known what it was.
Yeah, like
exactly.
that. And the only reason I know that is because I was obsessed with Goodnight, Mr. Tom when I was little. So
Okay.
like,
Right.
But yeah, so like the BBC one starts a little bit sedate, right? It's also like blue skies. There's birds chirping as they arrive at the. So it doesn't seem that like malicious.
Right.
Whereas the
Or
opening of the
grim,
Walden media starts with an air raid. I mean,
the first shot is a German aircraft coming in to bomb them
from the cockpit, right?
Yes,
Like,
from the perspective of the German pilots. Yeah. The first sounds we hear, the first words that we hear, are the sound of the German pilots talking to each other in German. Yeah.
And so we get an imminent threat of what's happening in the air, and then that brings us down into their house. The actual bombs.
Yeah, we follow the bombs down.
We follow the bomb
towards their
down.
house. Yeah.
That's how we meet the kids. Like, get out of the way.
Yeah.
And they're running for the air raid shelter, and Edmund goes back in to get the photograph of their father, and Peter follows him and nearly kills him because he's so mad that he risked their lives. And I just found that whole thing really interesting because in the first 30 seconds you have imminent threat and a lot of information about these 4 kids, like their dynamics, who's pill, who's in charge or thinks he is, and that there's no father in sight, and all this transitionary stuff that we see a lot in fairy tale. We got in both of those, like, we're leaving the city, we're going to the country, we're leaving threat, we're going to safety. We had that kind of progression in both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that also struck me that I'd never really processed before. First of all, let me admit it's been a long time since I watched the BBC version, so there's a lot about the later stuff that I don't remember. But one of the things that sort of surprised me on rewatching, because I hadn't remembered this element of it, in the new version, in the Disney version. Peter and Susan are very noticeably older than Lucy and Edmund. Like, there's a big gap.
Do you want me to pull up the slide?
Sure, yeah.
Let's make sure I have a tab open.
Yeah.
Oh, bear with me. Keep chatting. I'll pull it up.
Anyway, so that in the BBC version, the 4 of them are almost all the same height. So like when they're all standing in a row, they all look almost exactly the same. Lucy's a little shorter. But in particular, like this picture actually of them on either side of Aslan, Edmund is noticeably shorter. The two
I know. I'm like, in the actual film, I think they're like the same height.
They're the same height. Like, I thought Edmund was a little taller. Like, it was hard. I remember, okay, the first shot, I'm like, wait a second, which one's Peter and which one's Edmund? Like, I wasn't sure. Once they started talking, like, I could tell, of course. But yeah, it was not especially
Yeah, I mean,
clear.
if you just showed me this one, I don't know if I'd be able to tell which one was Peter and Edmund right off the bat, Like, after a second you can, but they do look much closer in age in the...
Yeah, whereas, again, it's very noticeable. Yes. Yeah, there you go. I mean, Lucy comes up to Peter's sternum, right? That look how much taller Peter is than Edmund. There's no question who's the older brother and who's the younger brother there. It's very. So that was just like the way that they kind of asserted the family dynamics there. Whereas the effect, I think, it seems to me that one of the consequences of this particular choice is in the BBC version, we are clearly getting 4 children, right? Whereas in the Disney version, we are getting 2 who are in like transitional quasi-parenthood relationships, right?
Yes.
I mean, they're not like, and that's a big issue, right? In this film, as I recall, Edmund is always complaining from the very beginning that like Susan is not his mom and should stop talking to him like as if she were mom, right?
Yep.
But she does talk to him like mom. And, so Peter and Susan both assert like parental authority over their younger siblings. And that dynamic is a really prominent element within this story as they've done it here. Whereas, again, the other one, when Peter and Edmund are arguing, even in that first scene when they're having dinner upstairs, it's just like 2 equals squabbling.
It just feels like siblings, right? It just feels like brothers.
Yeah. As I say, so, and I think it's a really remarkable. It's not something that I had thought about, but it's a pretty significant choice to have, whether you have 4 children, all of whom really just look like children, right? Susan and Peter are still like prepubescent.
Yeah.
And that's important, I think. I mean, or rather, that's a choice with serious consequences for how we see the rest of the story. We've got 4 prepubescent children, and there are differences in relationships. There are still the hierarchies of the olders and the youngers among them, but having the 2, pubescent children and then the 2 younger children does make for a really interestingly different dynamic among them.
Yeah, there's a real separation with these. And I think we knew that Prince Caspian was coming, but we weren't confirmed that Don Treader was coming when this one came out. I think they said there was going to be 2. This is just my memory. I didn't look it up. But I do wonder if that was a choice because they don't feature in the second. As much.
Right. Well, in the third, especially, is when is where they don't come back.
Right.
Yeah.
Like,
no.
They kind of had to show them aging out already, so like we're already kind of having this divide be established of like these guys can play this now, but they're not the same as the folks that will stay with us for a while.
Yeah. As JJ said, it's the difference between 4 children and 2 children and 2 teens. Yeah, that's very much what we get in the second film. And it's interesting. I'm trying to think, as far as like relationship with the text is concerned, this is one of the fascinating things about this particular choice, about the age and maturity of the children is concerned. There's stuff in the text, like either choice basically allows you to emphasize different things that are actually in the text. For instance, there are lots of references in the text. The 4 Pevensies are called children lots of times, right? And I think of the even in this is me thinking ahead to Prince Caspian, but even in Prince Caspian, in which they're older, they're a year older than this. I'm thinking of the line from Trumpkin the Dwarf in the book where he says, we were hoping for, help, but we're awfully fond of children, but, it's the way in which the discrepancy between the outward appearance of 4 children and what they're supposed to mean, right? What they're supposed to do, the fact that they have this destiny, that, they have this purpose that they're supposed to achieve that Aslan has given. That's supposed to seem kind of like strange or at least counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
And the BBC casting choice accomplishes that element of it much better. Like that the 4 children in the BBC version don't look like they're likely to be, the saviors of Narnia, right? And I'm not saying that these 4 Pevensey children in the later film like absolutely do look like, no, like this is a slam dunk for like saviors of Narnia, but it's still different. I mean, how much younger is Peter than the some of the, lads who went off to war already? You know?
Yeah, I wouldn't go to slam dunk, but like when you see this shot of him on the front cover, like that seems fitting.
Yeah.
And also interestingly here, like Lucy's left off this cover on both versions. So like the child is not present. We have Edmund, who's kind of the youngest of the 3 of them, but he's still set back. He's in 3rd place.
Yes.
And they all look ready for battle. Whereas these, oops, sorry, I'm poking ahead to something I wanted to talk about.
Yes. Yes.
Whereas these guys
do not look ready for battle.
Nobody looks quite ready for battle in these.
No,
I mean,
they
look like they're ready for their school pictures.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And even, well, it's hard because the picture you have of the Disney 4, that's at their coronation scene. At the end, right? So they're not in their awkward British school children clothes still.
No, but I mean, you guys know I want to talk about the beavers, so we can go ahead to that. But like, you can see even this top left one, like even when they're in the clothes that they grabbed from the wardrobe, or even when they're in the stuff that they arrived in, it's still a different vibe. Like it does feel, I mean, the fur coats are a little bit different. They do feel quite grand. But...
Right, and that's pointed out in the book too, that they look like royal robes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then you can see them there in their school uniforms, or it's not school uniforms, in their home clothes.
British clothes,
yeah, British clothes.
Yes.
A little different than this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, what I was saying was there are elements from the book that are that really come out from the BBC casting, right? The whole 4 children. This is counterintuitive. How could these 4 random boys and girls have any impact on the destiny of Narnia? Like that kind of thing is really emphasized by this. However, the roles that Peter and Susan, and especially Peter, are asked to step into in the book, the relationship between Peter and Edmund, the level of responsibility that Peter especially is given, feels much more natural, because it does feel. Aslan does treats all of them in the book. Aslan treats all 4 of them seriously and with respect, but he treats Peter and Susan in a more in a more sort of proto-adult way than he treats Edmund and Lucy. I think that's pretty clear when he, again, especially with Peter, when he's taking him aside and talking about his leadership responsibilities and stuff like that. It's very much a you are a grown up now, you're a man now and need to be thinking about, this kind of stuff. And that works better with the new casting.
And especially when you juxtapose that to like the conversations that he has with Edmund, where it's, basically chiding him like a parent and giving him forgiveness. Like it is a very different relationship. Peter, step up. Edmund, learn.
Yes. Yes. And Edmund does, I don't want to downgrade, Edmund's heroism in the battle at the end of the book is emphasized, right? So he does fight. But he's not given the responsibility to lead. He's credited with valor in battle, and he's credited even with cleverness in battle, in that he's the one who smashes the witch's wand and prevents her turning people into statues. And so, again, he's given credit for having thought of that and having acted boldly and having acted bravely. But that's not the same thing as Aslan taking him aside and being like, I've got to... I need to. I'm putting you in charge. I am explicitly putting you in an adult role.
He just stepped into his own bravery. He didn't step into the role of
Yes,
leadership.
yes, exactly. And so
Maybe
there,
it's not even bravery, just like not selfishness.
well, yeah. I mean, and that's of course also for Edmund in particular a very important element, that he puts himself at risk in order to save others, and that's of course an important indication of his own changing of course, right? Since his experience, and since his forgiveness. But anyway, I, yeah. So this is a really to me, it's a really interesting adaptation example. This particular choice, right? Because both choices I think are totally defensible. And both choices sort of bring out and bring home more firmly different aspects of the story in the text.
And I quite like that they were like, oh, I don't know, I can't do math, like 15, 20 years apart, because you see a certain level of growth in how things could be retold. Like, yes, they had better technology. Yes, they had a much better budget and things like that. But there's such a nice difference between these two that one's not right, one's not wrong. It's just so nice to see these two versions and be like, both of these make sense. One looks a little nicer, but that's really all I gotta say in terms of like how they tell story.
Yeah.
It works, and I kind of like the dynamic between them. Lucy always rubbed me the wrong way in the 88 one, though. I thought she should really look like a much younger kid. But that's my own thing. I really like the
I really like the new Lucy also.
I really like this Lucy.
Yeah. I thought,
But again, that's just my own preconception. There's nothing wrong with the old Lucy. It's just what you picture. Like, as Jean said, my headcanon. This film also matched my headcanon a bit better. Even though I had this one in my head from when I was little, this just seemed a bit more grand and appropriate.
Yeah.
Even this shot, like, we're so perfectly framed here. It is so regal. It is so rule of thirds lined up.
right.
Yeah. You want to cheer for it.
Yeah. It's, well, so thinking for a moment, thinking backwards, thinking about the text and what is going on in the text with this, even just, again, thinking back about this choice of the kids and what they look like, right? Lewis in the book doesn't have to tell us. He doesn't have to tell us. Like, how much evidence of having gone through puberty is there in the bodies of Peter and Susan, right? He never mentioned, like, he doesn't describe them in
I don't really want him to.
No, we don't want him to.
Either. No, thank you. Yeah.
But that's the point. Like, he can just say, they're boys and girls and older boys and girls. And there are ways in which I think, I know that my own experience of reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which gets emphasized, or which gets heightened by what happens at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But my own experience is they change.
Yeah.
Like, I feel very confident that my picture of Peter, like, let's just take Peter, for instance. My picture of Peter in scene 1, on that first page, when he and the 4 of them are up in the room trying to figure out what to do the next day in the rain, I think that's my mental picture of him is very different from my mental picture of him at the end in the battle. And of course, as I say, that gets heightened by the fact that at the end of the book, they literally grow up, right?
Yeah. We
are introduced to them as adults at the end of the book, after they've lived in Narnia, for like decades or whatever. And so my picture of them can be fluid in ways that's really hard to do. Aslan's Compass says that the actor playing Edmund actually grew 5 inches during filming. So I guess that's a way to do it. If you catch your actors at just the right time. But
I remember reading about that. They had to keep changing the level of apple boxes underneath him and stuff because his height changed so drastically between scenes.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. But anyway, yeah, no, it's because Lewis does this well, Tolkien does this well too. Not describing characters more than he has to do. and leaving you to imagine them, right? Yeah. It is, you think about the amount of time that especially a lot of modern authors spend describing how characters look like, right? Like exactly their hair color, like their features.
Their haircut,
Yeah, exactly. Like every detail. Nose. And honestly, I think that a lot of that comes from the fact that so many modern writers are influenced by movies. Like they're picturing a movie script when they're writing a novel often. I mean, at least that's the impression that I get. Because again, if I'm not doing a visual adaptation, I don't need that information. And in fact, I don't want that information most of the time. If there's something that's going to be important, like if somebody's hair color is going to be alluded to, for instance. I mean, like just to give a really simple example, Ron Weasley, right? It's important that I know that Ron Weasley has red hair because that's going to be an issue, right?
It's like a family trait throughout as well. Like when we spot a redhead, we know it might be a Weasley.
Exactly. It comes up, right? So by all means, make sure you let me know what color Ron Weasley's hair is. Do I need to know what color Hermione's hair is? I don't think I need to know what color Hermione's hair is. Like, I'm not saying like it's a bad thing, but you don't have to say. No. And a lot of people in books don't, even such basic things as that, and certainly not necessarily less than that. So it is to me a fascinating illustration of the difference between the written, the written medium and the film medium, that both of these two sets of Pevensies in different ways fit the books. And one of the reasons they both fit the books is that Lewis doesn't tell us that, that stuff.
Yeah, Aslan's compass, he's given us the dates. Lewis's timeline has Peter born in 1927, Susan in 28, Edmund in 30, and Lucy in 32. So Edmund and Peter are only 3 years apart in Lewis's brain.
Yeah.
But that's, again, not details we really need to know. Like, he doesn't need to
and details he doesn't tell us in the book either.
No, and I don't think that's as descriptive as what we see in the character relationship either. Mm-hmm. Because if you told me the years, okay, but if I see Peter putting Edmund in his place and saying, you were a risk, you almost got us killed, I see that dynamic immediately. Like, I don't need to be told, here's my birth certificate.
Right,
you get exactly. It in a much more clear way that way.
Yeah.
And I like that Mom's not even involved in that scene, like she's there, she's pulling him in, but I don't even know if she has a line. She's really to the side as they establish their dynamic.
Yeah, I think she's, as I recall, she's mostly just yelling like, come on, right, panic. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So,
and when these guys arrive, in contrast to the BBC version, it's dark and gloomy. They're forgotten on the platform. They're late to be picked up. The woman that picks them up is cold,
right?
Not very welcoming, So it's, again, we have the same sentence. And look at the two different openings that we got. A blue sky sunny day with a cold housekeeper welcoming them. But she wasn't like cruel. She was just like, this is the way we do things. She was very proper.
Yes.
Whereas the Walden was the same sentence, but decided to make it this massive contrast. I feel like I just kept seeing these massive contrasts of good and evil. Like it was just already being established of like leaving war and the absolute horrors of that, and then cold heart, and then the welcome of Narnia is just such a lovely escape. It's
I want to come back and talk about the character of the professor and his depiction in the openings especially, but the Macready, as the kids call her in the book, is very interesting. She barely gets a reference in that first paragraph. I mean, she does get a reference, right? And it's clear that she is stern, and that she does not
go back. If you want.
Yeah, she does. Like again, later on, it emerges that she is fairly stern, and she doesn't, hold with any nonsense from the children. But all we're told in the first paragraph is he lived in the professor, that is, lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. That's it. Like, she's only identified by name. Again, I'm not saying that they are building this idea of her coldness and sternness from nothing. Like, there's there's enough in the text to justify it. The thing that we learn about her is that she seems to be of the, like, children should be, like, well, neither seen nor heard, really. Like, she wants them sort of out of the way. But it's the only specific thing we're told there is that she's told them very sternly when she's showing people over the house, when she's giving tours of the house, that they shouldn't be underfoot. Like, they're supposed to not be underfoot the Pevensey kids seem to take that really seriously. Like, so I can certainly believe that she was very serious and possibly threatening when she told them that, because they all seem to think something horrible is going to happen if they get caught by the Macready and like, you know, what she's threatened there. But so again, there's, like, textual warrant for it, but it's not a part of the story. It's certainly not a part of the beginning of their story. The coldness of their reception by Mrs. Macready in both film versions is very much foregrounded, right? In the BBC version, she seems to, like, actively, like, she seems to positively resent the warm reception that the professor wants to give to them, right?
Like, you can feel the sneer, right?
Yes.
She's like, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, again, it's not that that's ridiculous or wholly inconsistent, but it's an element of that is not obviously there. It's certainly not foregrounded in the story. Yeah. The primary emphasis, especially in chapter 1 of the kid's life in the professor's house, is one of freedom and nobody paying a lick of attention to them, right?
Which is such a, like, you know, really classic trope in fantasy children's literature of, like, you have to get the parents and the grown-ups out of the way so these kids can have the adventure. So here we are.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's and so isn't it interesting how Lewis imposes that onto the historical occasion of the air raids, right? That juxtaposition is something that I found really fascinating. You know, ever since I learned during the war because of the air raids meant, right? I've been really fascinated at that juxtaposition. There are a lot of expedients that different authors of, whether they be of fairy tales or of modern fairy tale adaptations or whether they be of other fantasy, you know, children's fantasy novels. There are a lot of expedients that authors have taken to get children out from under the supervision of their parents in order to have the adventures that they're going to have, right? This one is a very remarkable expedient that he takes to take this time of complete terror,
chaos,
and childhood trauma. You know, you are leaving the city because either your house has been destroyed or could be destroyed at any minute, leaving behind your parents, whom you have to believe might be killed at any moment and whom you will, you know, quite possibly never see again.
Like,
right?
The whole practice, like, I can't even imagine now. So, like,
Phil
was just asking, like, I'm blanking on why they went to stay with the professor. This is just what they did in World War II. Like, I think it started with volunteers, and then I think it was almost forced, where it was like, oh, you have a spare bedroom, you're getting 4 children.
You're getting children
and
from
they just
the city,
shipped kids out of London. So they stuck a tag on their coat. They gave them gas masks in a canister. They got 1 bag each, and they got shipped to the countryside.
I don't think there's ever any indication of, like, a familial relationship between Professor Kirk and the Pevensey family. I mean,
and usually I don't think
a relationship continues later on. Like, Peter goes to study, Professor Kirk takes Peter as a pupil later, but it's because they already knows him, right? Because he was living in his house. As, again, one could imagine would happen, right? You get to know kids that come to live in your house. And
Phil, total chance.
As far as I mean, I don't recall. I might be misremembering, but I don't recall that there's anything. Yeah. So no, it just sort of happened. But again, like, to take that moment, to use that moment of all moments, right? I mean, that was a time when many a child was free to have fantasy adventures in the sense that they were out from under their parents' supervision. But my goodness, like, that's a really remarkable contrast.
But also, what a cool way to do it, to ground it in something historical fact. We've talked about that a lot too, that like as soon as you mention something recognizable, it gives credence to other stuff in the story.
Yeah.
So like starting us from a known point of, oh, this is a story about kids being shipped out of the countryside in World War II. Oh, no, it's not, So
Yeah.
I quite like that it sets us up for that, and then we have this little spin that's a bit different.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not my parents died in a car crash, it's World War II.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So the book was published in 1950. So obviously, this is something, there's a very good reason why C.S. Lewis only spends one sentence on it, right? And that's because, well,
Everyone knew about it.
I was going to say, yeah. I was about to say everyone in the audience would remember it. Of course, that's not true, probably, of children under the age of like 7, which would have been a non-zero percentage. But certainly, I mean, yeah, we're talking about, it's published 10 years after this was set to have happened. It's supposed to have happened in 1940. And yes, Aslan's Compass, exactly. Lewis himself actually hosted some evacuees. Yes, like this was a lived experience on the other side for him. So yes, there's, as I say, there's a good reason why he's not trying to downplay it. He just doesn't need to say anything about it. I mean, everybody remembers. Everybody remembers this. I mean, goodness, it would be like. No, not like. It would be almost precisely the same as if right now you wrote a book and you said, this is a story about something that happened during lockdown.
Right.
During COVID lockdown. You wouldn't have to write more sentences than that, right? Now you just tell about like, the lockdown and every, whatever else. Like it's, this is as familiar and at least as salient to the people who were reading the book when it was published as such a statement would be nowadays, right, for us. Anyway, so that's but yet in the very brief evocation, so this is why I think that the expansion of that sentence into the multi-minute sequences that we get, especially in the Disney film, I think it's excellent. I think it's really important because I think that Lewis absolutely was not just like banking on familiarity with it, but there was this whole freight that went along with that, right?
Yeah.
He didn't have to remind people like this was in wartime. They would have been afraid, they would have been, and how that maps onto they get into Narnia and now they're at war, and there are these, evil creatures who are trying to conquer and attack the good Narnians, and destroy them and take over. Like the relevance and applicability to the Pevensey children's real world experience, again, is not something he would have had to recall to any of his audience in England in 1950. But to especially an American audience in 2005, wasn't it 2005 when the Disney one came out? To an American audience in 2005, it absolutely does need to be recalled.
I am surprised the BBC version didn't do a little bit more of it, because 1988 is a long time away from these things happening. And I mean, we still have like the mention of it, but you'd think there would be some sort of visual threat shown at the beginning. I don't know, maybe that's my own kind of expectation though, because it needs to start with drama. And a 1988 children's BBC production does not need to start with drama. It's like, I think you also have to think about the time it is, who it was coming from, and it was specifically made for children through the BBC.
Is it just me? I mean, I'm far from a connoisseur of BBC TV specials, but opening with kid like being in a compartment on a train, isn't that like a that felt like a very BBC
Known.
TV show
Yeah.
opening. Like you need to do no other than just like,
I mean,
get
to
them
the
on a
point that you
train
and to the point that you kind of wonder if like the one studio that they shot in just had the same train car that they redecorated.
yes. I mean, it just,
Entirely possible.
yeah.
And
Like
it changes into an 18th century coach if need be. Yeah.
yes. I mean, it struck me as an extremely BBC opening. But yeah, I mean, I wonder too, simply if it's just like a BBC thing. I mean, again, I don't know. I mean, I think some of our live audience are in fact, English people who were alive in the 80s and might be able to tell us. But I rather suspect that even when, yes, now, the difference between the setting and the time of the airing of the show is now 48 years. Yet it seems to me very likely that the kind of, the understanding of what that was about, and the cultural weight of that is something that would likely have still been so much more familiar that they wouldn't have felt the need to emphasize it quite so much.
And it is still BBC. I mean, the UK is going to remember it more than an American audience, so it's entirely possible that it's still much more. I mean, now living here, I know that it's way more in everybody's minds than
Right.
it was me growing up, but
Yeah.
you still see the scars of World War II in London and everywhere else.
Right.
And still hear the stories of like the families that were made and broken by these kids coming out to the countryside and how they couldn't find each other after the war. And it's just kind of amazing, like how much of an impact this had. But at the same time, you're like, well, of course it did. So I don't know, just that comparison too of in the 1988 one for it to just be a little bit more nonchalant kind of matches with C.S. Lewis.
Right.
It is a little bit
Right.
more of like this thing happened.
Right.
Moving on.
Yeah, we all know.
Whereas-
It's again, it's not the same as like we all remember this happening 10 years ago, but yeah, as Phil
Right.
says, we still have Remembrance Sunday every year,
But don't forget, lest
yeah.
we forget.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that to me felt like probably a sufficient explanation for why the BBC didn't feel the need to kind of beat on that. I was still a little bit surprised at how chill everybody was. Like that was the thing that really struck me, that the moms were all like, bye, like they were waving and smiling at the guy. Like I totally, without
Yeah.
any
It
knowledge.
wasn't a threat.
No, without any knowledge, I would absolutely have thought this was some kind of vacation train, like that, or like all the kids going off to summer camp or something like. I mean, it's what it looked like. It's what it looked like. The moms being
Yeah.
like, "See ya, bye,"
Yeah.
come back soon.
And even getting into their train compartment, they were just like, oh, fine train.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, oh, my mom,
Yeah, and even the tags on them, like the pinning of the tags, was something that was more emphasized, and that whole element of, the sort of the dehumanizing element of the tags, and the sort of terrifying, like, what if my child's label gets torn off? What would happen to my child, and where would she end up? Like, yeah. Anyway, it's like that stuff. Those fears, both from the parents' side and from the children's side, get emphasized a good deal more in the recent version. So again, I definitely appreciated that. I felt that it was a brilliant move, especially given that we're targeting, not exclusively, but they were certainly targeting an American audience with that film, and it was extremely helpful.
And it was a big blockbuster, 180 million pounds.
Yeah.
Like it had to start with a bang. Like they're
Yeah.
gonna grab your attention. It has a different intent. It has a different drive than the 1 million pound, which was a huge budget at the time. But like, £1 million adaptation. And just in terms of cost and budget too, like putting together any kind of period dress wartime scene, it wouldn't have been like astronomical, but it would have been a pretty easy thing to say, we don't need to do that. Let's just get them on the train.
Yeah.
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 You never know what decision's going to be made to make that happen. But if the whole purpose was to make sure that one sentence happened, they left London and they're in a country house, we can do it like this.
Yeah. Yes. JJ is pointing out Peter's line in the book of "We've fallen on our feet and no mistake," he says to his siblings. So it's like as you can see on the text here, it's the first line of dialogue in the text. We've fallen on our feet and no mistake. It does betray a kind of anxiety. They don't know where they're going to end up. They don't know what they're going to, what conditions they're going to be living under with what people, what kind of authorities are they going to be placed under and what might they force them to do? I mean, who knows? Like, right. They could be anything from, they could be going anywhere from like, an abusive drunk in a, ratty house,
right.
To, a country mansion, right? Or
slave labor.
Exactly. A farmer who could use them as slave labor. There are all kinds of terrible outcomes that they could have being sent off to a literal stranger, stranger not only to them, but to their parents, right? In the countryside. So it does show that they were uncertain about that. It's still a very chill kind of statement, right? I mean, this is going to be perfectly splendid, says Peter. I think it's the tone of this conversation that they had, which also contributed in my youth to me totally missing the like incredible seriousness, even like the like traumatic and scarring nature of the context of this story, because they don't sound traumatized when they're talking to each other. This is going to be perfectly splendid. Like, okay, like that, I think the connection that I had in my own head, I first read this when I was 7. And so when I was 7, the kind of picture I had in my head about this was like when you get taken by your parents to stay at grandma's house for a week, right? That kind of thing. And like, how much is that going to be fun? Is that going to be horrible and boring,
right?
Or whatever? You don't know. Like you're being taken on a visit with your parents. That was kind of like the mental shelf that I put this scene in, right? Kids being like, oh, actually, like this could be cool,
Yeah, we might have fun.
Yeah, exactly.
But also interesting in just these little lines to start to see, because we don't have, them diving into an air raid shelter to establish the dynamics. We do have them kind of establishing the dynamics just in this first page. Like, we've fallen on our feet and make no mistake. That just sounds like what he thinks an old man should say.
Right.
And, and I think he's an old deer. I don't know. It could be very appropriate for the time, but it does feel very like performative to a certain respect.
Yes.
So I quite liked it when Edmund jumped in and was like, "Oh, stop."
Yes.
He's like,
come off it. Right.
Yeah.
Don't go on talking like that. Yes.
Yeah.
Trying to talk like mother. And that is, I think, and that's really interesting, right? It isn't just that Susan is asserting maternal authority over Edmund in the book. It's that Edmund perceives that Susan is deliberately imitating, like she's performing the maternal role. She's trying to make herself sound more like a mom than she actually is. And that's really interesting, right? And I agree with you. It does. Again, when I look back on it now with a fuller understanding of the historical context, I think that you can see both Peter and Susan trying to put a brave face on things, right? Trying to assert this kind of normality there.
Well, and it's probably their own coping mechanism too, right? Like,
exactly.
They've also been shipped off. They don't have mom and dad in front of them. So I guess I better assume this role. It's kind of like a cloak of security to be able to be like, I have a job to do. I got to do this job.
Exactly. Right. And if you were there, and there's something a little bit comforting, like, mom's not here, but I can be mom, right? And that will be that there will be some comfort in that. But notice how all of these things that we're describing also fit very well either adaptation choice, right? Yes. If you've got all 4 of them looking like children, right? If they're all 4 prepubescent children, Peter and Susan's performativity would be a little bit more obviously performative here, right? And the fact that it's a coping mechanism, which is, I think, implicit in the text, is something that would then really rise to the surface. If you, like in the Disney one, you have Peter and Susan looking definitely older and definitely mid-teens, then now all of a sudden they are more clearly in a parental role. And the emphasis now becomes on Edmund's resenting of them stepping into that role, which would clearly seem to be the natural and even in some sense appropriate role for the older children to take to the younger children in that instance, with Edmund as the middle one who's close enough to the edge of that,
That he can walk
step himself that he resents being treated like one of the little kids, right?
Yeah.
As
and
anyone
just at
who's
the right
ever
age where he's starting to get really surly and
Yes.
be like, well, I'm not one of the little kids.
I'm not one of the
you
little
know?
kids. You can't treat me like a little kid.
But in that sentence, it also reveals it where he's like, he was tired, but he's trying to pretend that he wasn't tired. Like, I get it. Like, he's a little cranky pants right now. He just needs a little
Yes.
snooze. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Now, and I mean, and anybody who, has had younger siblings or who has been a middle sibling understands this, this sort of dynamic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so let's talk about the professor, then we can talk about the beavers.
Yeah.
The beavers aren't in the opening scene, but just that. So notice again what we get about the professor in the text. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair which grew over most of his face as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. So we get an assessment of the professor, which is on the one hand objective, right? We don't get this from the children's point of view. But yet it's also describing the children's point of view, right? He's this like massive white hair, everywhere on his head and on his face, right? And he looks very strange.
I'm trying to get two examples of it, so
Yeah,
we'll have them shortly.
We're told almost nothing about what he was actually like or what he actually says, right? It doesn't say, for instance, that he was kind to them. It just says he's very old, right? Which could probably mean 50, right? From the perspective of the children. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, he's a very old man with shaggy white hair. The only thing that it says about him, about his personality, is that they liked him almost at once. So it's not about him; it's about them, right?
Yeah.
So he acted or spoke in some way to inspire them all to like him almost at once. Though he's really funny looking, and Lucy was afraid of him, and Edmund thought he looked funny, right? That's right. JJ says old enough that his hair was white. I know, but dude, my hair was white by the time my beard was white by the time I was 35. So like it varies. Let me just say. But anyway, yeah. So right, I don't doubt that he was old, but again, a very old man I think is funny in the context.
But really, you just kind of need that difference. Like, he just needs to be clear that he's not one of the kids. He is other, and we've established that just by their own descriptions.
Yeah. Anyway, like, so one of the things that interests me here is that we get very little real information. And again, one of the things that I want to emphasize, this is, when we started doing this, like, let's do a close comparison of the openings thing, one of the goals that we had for that whole series of discussions was trying to understand better what is the language of visual storytelling and what is the language of verbal storytelling, right? And the thing that strikes me most about this, I don't think that either adaptation of the professor is like bad or wrong or, doing problematic things. I like both of them as readings of the text, as in their relationship with the text. But the point I would make is that the first thing we're told about the character and demeanor of the professor is nothing. we're not told anything. We're given no data about what he said or how he acted. The only data we're given is how the children felt about him. They liked him almost at once, which leaves us, the readers, free, especially if we're children, free to imagine, oh, I've met nice, very old grown-ups who I liked very much, right? Mm-hmm. And so I can kind of imagine. So
fill that gap in.
Yeah, you fill that gap in. Any impression that we get that he's kindly, that he's gentle, that he maybe like, is more welcoming and accepting to them than Mrs. Macready is, that he is perhaps like that he takes them seriously and treats, like some of these things get influenced by the actual conversation that we see him having with him afterwards. Right. But in the beginning, we get no information about any of that. And we're merely left to fill all of that in. And that I think is really important.
Yeah, and such a great device in literature, right?
Yeah.
Like for all of us to be able to paint this own picture, it just draws you in so easily without a lot of effort. It's great to be able to fill in that gap. It's also pretty risky when you go to an adaptation because now I'm going to show you exactly what this person should look like.
Yeah. I mean, you have to. Like that is the burden of doing a visual adaptation.
Exactly.
Is that you must make these choices.
And burden is just the right word for it. And we talked about it a lot with Rings of Power as well, like all these casting choices off the Silmarillion where we have no description of what these people look like. Yeah. And here we are casting. Why on earth is that wrong? It's just wrong from your headcanon, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So yes, it is an almost extreme example of saying little and leaving much to your imagination. And it's fascinating to see how the adaptations chose to fill in that blank. Mm-hmm. Right.
I like that it was the kid's feeling too, because I kind of always went to Golden Retriever. Like they thought that he liked, like that they liked him. So therefore it's like a puppy, it's a safe space. It's non-threatening. Right. We're okay with this. Like, right. Yeah, I mean, you often hear when people are talking about films, the guy that kicked the dog is obviously the villain. Like, the role of the dog can't be understated in a film. Like, we were just watching something last night, and it was Apple TV, The Gorge. It's like their new sci-fi fantasy thing. And the opening scene is this, like, loner sitting on a beach, and a dog runs up to him and sits next to him, and he, like, gets a little snuggle, and then he runs away. And it's like, so we know the dogs like him. Okay, so he's a good guy. Got it, yeah.
Right, yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, I just quite like that I had that kind of feeling attached to the professor. Like, this is not a threat. These kids are okay. He's also not going to detract from what they're about to do. Because we've removed the parents. We have this parental figure, but he's not in the way. He's not getting involved.
And I will also say that especially in the context, this is particularly pronounced in the context of the Disney one, where they have gone out of their way to emphasize like the trauma of the situation that, which the children are being separated from their parents. Both adaptations, as we've said, go out of their way to make Mrs. Macready cold and authoritative and intolerant of children from the very first time they meet her, right? So that the dynamic that we are introduced to is still there's the adult figure who is the authoritative one who is scary and you want to avoid, but there's the nice one, right, that you can perhaps take refuge with. And it's nice that the nice one outranks the mean one, right? So appeal is possible, right, to the nice one. And so I totally, establishing that as a framework to help us get behind what we're seeing and the dynamics of what we're seeing. Yeah. It makes me think of some of the conversations we've had about the War of the Rohirrim and the way, the kind of stuff, the kind of personal stuff they had to add to the historical chronicle summary that we got in Tolkien's text in Appendix A, right? Where we hear nothing at all about what life was like for the people of the Mark who were in Helm's Deep, right, being besieged. We hear nothing about what did Rohirrim who were stuck in the Hornburg think when Helm was going out and killing Dunlendings by night, right? Like, we don't know any of those things because that's not part of that story, right? But when
we could infer,
when you're going to invite us, when the film is going to invite us, like, they have to answer those questions. Like, they have to show us that.
And that's what's so fun. Like, what were they thinking? Let's think it through. And I won't spill the beans because I can't do what you guys did, but it just makes me think of the conversation you, Ben, and Kirsten had when we were talking about Hunt for Gollum and like, what could make sense here? And the three of them just batted around like, what do we actually know? What was actually happening?
What's at stake there in that story?
And like what's been written down by Tolkien in timelines and like geographies and where are these people and what is possible, and starting from that point and being able to fill in those gaps, just really cool.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, but the point is, you can see the visual adaptations doing those things. Like, they can't. Lewis in the book can just mention Mrs. Macready and largely leave you free to imagine those dynamics, right? And I think it very likely, I mean, I certainly had the vague impression that Mrs. Macready was pretty stern and unfriendly, and therefore, but she's not like. She has a sort of authority, but she doesn't have a really deep parental authority. She's not the one really in charge. And so you can work to kind of get around her. Like, they do work to get around her. Like, it's okay for them to play around and do anything in the house as long as they don't get caught, right? As long as they don't draw her attention, right? Because then, like, she'll probably yell at them or whatever. But anyway, like, so we're left to imagine all of that. But in the film, they can't just leave us to imagine it.
And that serves as a really good boundary of like, well, we can't be totally amok because there is this Macready wandering around. So like, it is a really handy kind of control line.
Yes.
I do like how it was done differently in the two, though. And there's a little chat going on in Twitch of this fantastic quote from the BBC one where Macready says, "This is their function. This is about the household staff. We must not deprive people of their function. We all have a part to play." And the way she delivers it is like that. We all have a part to play. So it's like she's asserting her own role by being like, "I will tell you the rules, and this is how we do things."
Right.
And it felt like her kind of grasping at this role as well, and like trying to control what she could.
Yes.
And the only thing she could control was telling those kids what the staff's role was. Okay, you have that, lady, go for it.
Right. Well, and again, you could, if one wants to do a sympathetic reading of BBC Mrs. Macready, right, you can also see like her own life and world is being turned upside down in the war here. Right now, this family of 4 unknown children is being foisted. She did not sign up for this, right? This is not part of her job description when she became housekeeper of this house.
And you assume every man of the house is at war, so it's a very different dynamic in that house anyway. And then you're just throwing 4 kids in the middle of it that she has to look after as well, and even
the reference again in the BBC one when she talks about the inconvenience to the kitchen staff, and the professor points out that the 2 maids who are standing right there are also the kitchen staff, right? And asks like, what do you think about this, right? That, as you said, like, I bet you there were other servants as well, like other manservants who went off to the war, right? So that,
I mean, even if your frame of reference is just Downton Abbey, it happened.
It happened. Yeah, exactly.
We saw that.
Exactly. So, but again, all of those elements that they're bringing out are things that. So here's the thing that this stuff all sort of made me think of. I talked about ages ago here in this show, right? We talked about different categories of adaptation, retelling adaptations and fill in the blank adaptations and, modulation adaptations. And I still think that those are useful categories. They are very different kinds of creative projects. But of course, one has to admit, every adaptation is always a fill in the blanks adaptation, because if the text is at all well written, there will be lots and lots of gaps to fill in. Gaps which are left to the imagination of the readers in the book, but which create questions that have to be answered in the actual show.
And it doesn't matter how detailed your text is. We're still going to find gaps. That's the beauty of fan fiction, and
Right.
the pervasiveness of it. People are going to find things that inspire them and then they go off on a tangent. That's what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yes. Yeah. Everett is pointing out that in the BBC version, Mrs. Macready also seems to have an odd prejudice against Londoners, which which Phil points out is also totally realistic.
Yeah.
Right? Yes. Yes. Exactly. Right.
She's a country mouse.
She
She's like, oh, city folk,
city folk. Right. City children. It's like the worst of all possible things. Yes. Yeah. So anyway, I thought it was really fascinating to me. This is a thing I had never thought about before, but when I was watching the films introduce the professor, and I was thinking about how comparing it with this, like, sort of, I mean, it's not exactly an introduction, and yet it is. Like, we are given an impression of the professor, and the conversation when we first actually get a conversation with him, right? When Peter and Susan come to him for advice, when Lucy seems to be going bonkers, with insisting on this whole wardrobe story. That conversation, we are prepared for that conversation by this little passage here.
Yeah.
And so the challenge that I was much more conscious than I've ever been before of the challenge that the filmmakers had, like that they were presented with when they, like, we are told, and it makes a great deal of sense, that he would meet them at the front door when they arrived. Like, that seems only polite that he would do so, right? Though he doesn't do it in the Disney version.
Right.
In the Disney version, he is behind closed doors. All we get is literally his shadow behind the door.
And
right?
you're not to disturb
And
him.
the injunction not to disturb him, and Lucy's look of fear, which is alluded to in the book, right? Lucy's a little afraid of him. But in the book, she's only left to be afraid of the idea of him, right? So that was, not having him appear there at all was an even more aggressive choice, whereas the BBC tried to recreate a performance by the professor that would fit with what we see of him later on, and would also fit this description, and set up the relationship for later. But anyway, it's the BBC decided to do more. The Disney version decided to do less than the text, which
Which is
is
interesting when you think about time and resource and all of that stuff. That's the decisions that are made. And you're like, oh, that is an interesting one of like how we played the different characters in different ways and who gets more screen time and why. And is there anything purpose wise? Is there anything that's served in the BBC one that isn't served in the Walden one because of screen time?
yeah.
Not really. Like, it's just done in a slightly different way.
Yeah, exactly. And Marie, I agree with you. One of the consequences of the choice that the Disney film made is that it places us more in the perspective of Lucy.
Yeah.
Especially that arrival in the house. Lucy's perspective is really dominant in that moment, where I don't feel like it is, for instance, at the station, when they're all four of them standing at the station and thinking that they've been left behind. We do get a little bit of Lucy's perspective there, but I don't feel that we are put sort of forcibly in, but we're like following Lucy up the stairs of the house, right? And getting her experiences of seeing the shadow and being afraid and all that kind of thing.
I'm gonna have to look at the history of this. Maybe or I should have done beforehand. But I don't think it was Disney straight off. I
Oh,
think
I
it was
see.
I think it was definitely Walden because they were like the big name behind it. And then I think it was like Buena Vista distributed it, and Buena Vista was Disney's, and now it's on Disney Channel and stuff like that. But I don't think it was like a Disney production.
Okay.
And
I
and I don't think that's a massive distinction, but I don't think it fell into like the Fox and the Hound, the Tom and Huck.
no, I don't see
Didn't
it as
fall
part
into
of
that
that.
kind of like
Yeah.
Disney vault,
Yeah. Yeah.
which I do think does change kind of like how something is developed. Like it doesn't have the same kind of machine or audience expectation. It's kind of in the family, but slightly different wheelhouse. And I remember Walden being a big deal because I knew they had the rights to The Dark is Rising at the time, and Dark is Rising was in development, and you all know how I feel about that. So I was like, oh, but they did Narnia. They're going to do a good job. Fight.
Yeah, one of these days, we're gonna have to,
Yep.
you know, get you a nice double tall glass of scotch and sit down and talk about the Dark is Rising adaptation. But
Happily. I feel like Sarah and I could really do that as a special one-off.
yes, yes.
Challenge accepted. I'll let her know. I had students in a past class of mine ask if I would do that for Twilight too, and I was like, if there's whiskey, maybe. Okay, so I just want to show the images of the beavers before.
Yeah. Let's go back to the beavers.
I don't have anything like earth-shattering to share about them. I just have always used this as an example for adaptation.
Yes.
Let me make it big. So, like, you know, when I've run workshops with high schoolers and stuff, I'll start with the block of text, like we do for the openings, a block of text about the beavers, and then show these two different versions. And the reactions are just what you would expect them to be, just absolute hilarity as they see this one. Because, what?
Yes.
Compared to this. So, obviously, technology and budget, have come a long way. But I do also think there's something about the BBC side of it. Like, this is so quintessential pantomime to me, and like so expectation of the Brits would be fine with this. Like, you might have a little giggle the first time, especially as they walk and carry a teapot, but this kind of makeup and costume would not be foreign. Where I think for an American audience, it is quite foreign. But yeah, just two very different, distinct ways to adapt the same text, right? Are you going to go puppetry, or are you going to go digital? Are you going to go visual effects, or are you going to go props and actual? Like these are conversations we're still having. You know, anytime you hear something about light and magic or Weta, you know, we wanted to do as many practical effects as we possibly could, as if that's like a badge of honor. And it can be sometimes. It's really cool when you put that kind of work into it. But all of these are adaptation choices that just kind of change how you're telling something.
Yeah.
What they're telling, I think, is pretty similar in both of these. This one was way more believable to me because I loved the first introduction, because he looks like a normal beaver. I think it's a beaver. And Peter approaches him and is like, you know, come here, little guy. And he stands up and he goes, I'm not going to sniff it if that's what you want me to do. It was like, It's just such a great way to bring in the animals speak here.
Yeah.
As opposed to this, you're already like, what is going on? So when they start speaking, you're not floored by it either.
Yeah. So, okay. One of the things that really strikes me here. First of all, let me say a thing which might seem controversial, and that is these BBC beavers are very much closer to the text. Very much closer to the text. The text, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I think The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe exclusively, from within the text, I think the clear evidence is that Lewis was initially imagining anthropomorphic animals.
Mm-hmm.
Aslan walks on two legs with his arm around Peter at one point. Like, it is not. Later on in Narnia, even later on by the end of the book, I think, by the time we get to the point of Aslan's resurrection, he's acting much more thoroughly lion-y, like a real, though large, lion. But all of the animals in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, up through the first half or the first 2/3 of that story, act like people in animal costumes. I mean, I'm not saying this is one of the many ways in which Lewis and Tolkien are different. right? Is that Lewis's ideas evolved and changed, and he was just like, "Ah, yeah, it's fine, just leave it." Right? He doesn't reconcile it. He doesn't go back and revise it. Right?
It doesn't keep him up at night with him
no
rewriting history.
no
Making it work.
Exactly. He's just like, yeah, leave it in. Like, for instance, like, despite the fact that in The Magician's Nephew and in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there are wholly contradictory stories about the origin stories for the White Witch. Right. This is one of the reasons, by the way, that I think reading them in chronological order is such a bad idea. But because you can't go backwards. It's one thing to be told things, some vague but different things about the White Witch's origin in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then much later on be like, no, here's the real story. Like, that's cool, right? But to go from the real story to, wait, that's nothing like the book. I just read her story, and that's wrong. Like, the beavers are ignorant. They're stupid. They know nothing, right? Like, it just creates a much, much worse dynamic, I think. Yeah. Mrs. Manrique, I agree. Mrs. Manrique is pointing out how in The Magician's Nephew, when the animals are made into talking animals, all of them grow closer to human size. The big ones get a little smaller. The smaller ones get much bigger. So go back to the other beaver picture again. That first picture in the top left, inaccurate, according to the text. The beavers are much larger than normal beavers. Like, talking rodents are much bigger. Now, Reepicheep in in Prince Caspian is bigger than a normal. He's not just mouse size. He's not like 2 inches tall, right? But he is way smaller than he's described as being in the text. Anyway, so this is a really interesting kind of moment. Like, what decision are you making? What are you trying to capture? And go ahead.
I think that's like such a perfect example of like, these guys are the ones from the text. This is much closer to how they're described. But this is an excellent execution of how I wasn't expecting that. That it works if that's what you're trying to do. But if that's not what you're trying to do and you're just trying to show us kind of the fantastic, then we have it here too. So you can see that there was this conversation about like, what's the purpose? Are we going to shock them into animals talk, or are we going to bring them into a fantastic space where animals are the same size as you?
Right.
And decisions were made.
And it's obviously some of these decisions, it's easy to look at this and merely dismiss it as like a budget and technology difference. And I don't doubt that that's the number one purpose behind it. But to me, an explanation of like that kind of a causal explanation, well, in the end, it doesn't influence me very much. Like, there was still a choice to be made, right? If you couldn't afford, if you wanted to make the beaver, if you felt that it was important for the talking animals of Narnia to look like talking animals, right? You would not be content with this. You wouldn't move forward with this.
Yeah.
They could have done it differently. They didn't have to have people fully on screen walking around in enormous 6-foot beaver costumes, right? With those like awkward gloves sticking off at strange angles in the beginning. There are different choices you could have made in order to try to shoot for more verisimilitude, if that's what you wanted, right? Yes. And yeah, Aslan's compass, that's just what I was thinking of, the passage in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader where Reepicheep is described as being nearly 2 feet high on his hind legs. Yeah. Anyway, but it is interesting to me that neither one of these actually make the same choice that the book makes. And that's really fascinating, right? Both of them go in different directions. Both of them do two different things, but neither one of them really captures the whole experience. And I think that that's interesting. I generally like the Walden ones. I mean, as I said, I said that this is unlike the book, and it's true. This is not how they look in the book.
Right.
Also, by the way, notice that the wolf captain, who is named Malgrim in the British version and Fenris Ulf in the American version, which blew my mind when I discovered that, writes notes, like, I mean, it's, again, like, the animals are anthropomorphic. They tend to walk upright. They have opposable thumbs, apparently. They do all of these things. Even in the Walden version, there's no, I don't know, the beavers. Yeah, he does. Look, you can see it right here. Mr. Beaver has an opposable thumb. There. So they do anthropomorphize their physiology a little bit in order to make them able to hold teapots and things like that. So they do go a little bit. Even the posture, like Mr. and Mrs. Beaver posing there for their picture, it looks like posing for their Christmas card picture or something, right, in the bottom right. Obviously, that body language is human body language. That's not beaver body language that they're using, right? So I'm not trying to say that there's none of that anthropomorphic element in the film. There certainly is. But it's much more muted. They are much more going for authentic animals.
Absolutely. I also like these shots just for how you can start to see, some framing stuff. The top left one, Edmund's behind them. He's already separated from the pack. And then the one around the table, he's not even shown.
You don't see him.
He's not even there. Yeah, he's sulking behind Beaver. But yeah, just the images that you get, sometimes it's to show us a real life animal that, it talks and surprises us, but it also shows us at the same time the characters are having these separation moments and these different decisions that they have to make and different paths that they have to follow. So like all these things are kind of laid out for us. Yeah. And you have a little bit more time to do that in this one too, I think. I think BBC was very much like, move it along.
Yes. We did have... Yeah, agreed. And I did want to emphasize the anthropomorphism of the animals in Narnia decreases. Like, it's clear that Lewis's image of that decreases. By the time you get to A Horse and His Boy in book 5, Bree and Hwyn talking animals. That's my favorite of the Narnia books too. Always has
Mine
been.
Too. Well, Dawn Treader, I had a huge.
Dawn Treader is my number 2. But anyway, like the Horse and His Boy, Bree and Hwyn are horses. Like, they're not anthropomorphic in any way, right? Other than their brains and their ability to speak. There is nothing else about their physiology. They're indistinguishable visually from other horses. Like, you can't tell. Like, they pass as regular horses all the, for their whole lives. They are, supposed to be, probably stronger and hardier, than the other horses. But they're not. They don't look different. And the same is true when when Shasta gets to. Crosses the pass into Narnia, and you meet the stag and the hedgehog, right, and others in that scene when he is taken in by the 3 dwarfs. They're all those other animals are very animal. Like, the hedgehog is a hedgehog, right, and the stag is a stag, and so he has abandoned this idea of anthropomorphic animals, but it's obviously what he started with. I mean, you can't, if you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe carefully, it is perfectly clear that he is imagining something almost like a guy in a lion suit when it's for Aslan. And so again, there are ways in which that is truer to the text when you're doing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
But you can also see sitting around a table, them having a conversation about a standing up lion, being like, well, which one do we want? And I'm sure there's pros and cons to both of them. So it'd be interesting to hear what that conversation was and how they landed on this, because wouldn't it have been interesting to see the Walden version of a standing up Aslan? Yeah. Probably would have done well with it, but it's interesting. It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, where they draw the lines on, anthropomorphic physiology,
I'm laughing at Everett Bree as BoJack Horseman.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, clearly we have to continue. We don't have enough adaptations to talk about, but we can do Caspian and Don Treader at least.
We could. Yeah.
I don't think BBC didn't get beyond that either, did they? Did they do Silverchair?
Oh, the original BBC, I don't remember.
I think they might have. Somebody let us know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they did Silverchair.
Okay.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah. As I said, yeah. No, Lewis's imagination clearly does change to imagining animals as animals, but if they could talk and think for themselves. As JJ says in the last battle, the talking dogs are very doggish. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And it's what it shows, I think, is a shift in Lewis in what was the thing. So you may remember, people may remember in On Fairy Stories, Tolkien says that imagining, like being able to communicate with animals is one of these like deep, human myths. Like it's something that humans have imagined again and again. Like it's like a fundamental layer of human fantasy imagination, the ability to communicate freely with all things. And that's like the kind of thing that Lewis shifts to originally. In the original version, it's not that. And I found The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe made much more sense to me when I discovered, when I learned from C.S. Lewis's autobiography, Surprised by Joy, that he had written all of these whole stories and done this whole world building about animal land, these anthropomorphic animals. It's a totally different, what he was doing there was not just what Tolkien was imagining, when he talked about that fundamental human desire to want to communicate with other living things. That wasn't what animated him. It was, Lewis was thinking almost, it was like telling a story about people, but using animals to characterize the people in ways that would, anyway. So it's, as I say, I felt like I understood The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe a lot better, understanding where Lewis was coming from there, where his imagination began, and then watching it grow over and again, it's another reason why I don't usually get very pedantic when it comes to like, I don't know, preferences and choices and things, but I get awful pedantic when it comes to the publication order of the
book order
of the Chronicles of Narnia, because there are so many ways. Lewis peculiarly, his own imagination grows and develops. His concept of Narnia, his concept of the characters, his imagination of the world really progresses very noticeably as that series goes along. And if you read it in the wrong order, if you read it in the order of its final chronology, that all gets garbled and the whole thing becomes so much less understandable. But anyhow,
and that's one. Yeah. I'm super excited for the Netflix Greta Gerwig for all the right reasons, but it's also one of the things that Corey and I were like, because we saw a casting call go out for 2 kids, and we're like, 2 kids?
2 kids? Crap!
2 kids?
Tell me it's not Diggory and Polly. Please tell me it's not Diggory and Polly. Yeah.
But maybe they've already cast the 2 older ones and they're looking for the 2 younger. We don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. We don't know.
We'll see. But
my only hope is that, well, I don't know, of course, because everybody else has done it, like there are these 2 prominent adaptations that exist, right, that they are going to have to be on some level positioning themselves against, right? That's, anytime this comes back to, Rogue One, right? And when you're doing a film adaptation, which is dealing with other films. Now, again, the Rogue One situation is not like this, but it's more like the relationship between the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings and the Bakshi adaptation. But anyway, when there are these established adaptations out there that you're aware of, how you position yourself in relationship with that, or of course the Rings of Power in relationship to the Peter Jackson films, similarly, that's really important. I'm I could therefore see an argument that says, well, since everybody else has started with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that's where everyone will expect them to start, so that's where she should start too. I'm hoping that they don't just rebel against that and be like, so we're going to do things differently, and we're going to start in chronological order.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at all.
That wouldn't shock me.
But
Sadly, it wouldn't shock me.
and it would be nice to see, like pointed out here, it would be nice to see something that hasn't been committed to film yet. Like, it would be nice to see a fresh perspective. Just my own gut is very much the order we know, not the chronological.
Yeah, it's I
Not
agree.
right or wrong, just different from what I want.
Exactly. What I'm talking about here is my own personal preference. Well, again, I think there are objective reasons for why it's better to read the books in publication order rather than reading them in chronological order. That's not just my preference. Like, I'm ready to make objective arguments to say it is objectively better. Like, they are better books and a better series when you read them in publication order than when you read them in chronological order, which is nonsensical. But that's not to say that I think that the adaptation would be wrong or horrible if it started with The Magician's Nephew. They're doing a different thing, but it's true that it's not what I want to see. So, we'll see. So Phil, that's interesting. Phil says, how about a challenge? How would you edit The Magician's Nephew and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to make them consistent? Well, first of all, it's not just about consistency. It's also about the whole experience of the story. I also, by the way, I don't think... you can. I also don't think you should watch, like, if you're doing a Star Wars watch through, I don't think you should watch the prequels first. I admit I enjoy a good chronological sequence watch through, and I've done that before. But prequels have the power that they have because they rely upon the things that already exist. That's just a fact. If something is an actual prequel, that is, you know and are invested in the story, right? And now for the next stage, you're going to be told something that happened before. That story depends upon that, not chronologically, not even necessarily in its events, right? But the whole frame of that prequel is the stories that have already been told, the stories that you know. It wouldn't be a prequel. That's what prequel means. It's like a sequel, right? Except it's a thing that happens before. Tolkien invented that word, by the way. Did you know that?
Prequel?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
He did.
Good job, buddy.
But anyway, but The Magician's Nephew is a prequel. Like, it's designed to be a prequel. The power that story has, a lot of the power that story has, depends upon your knowing all of the things you have come to know and understand over the first 5 books of Narnia. And when you read it on its own first, before you read anything else, it doesn't have any of the impact. So it's for like narrative, for storytelling. So Phil, for me, it's not even about just consistency. There could be changes made, but honestly, Phil, it would have to be rewritten. I mean, like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe would have to be rewritten in order to, because again, the imagination is completely different. As we said, when you are interacting with the talking dogs in the last battle, you were absolutely hearing Lewis's imagination of what would it be like to talk to a dog, right? And it's fun. It's delightful to hear the dogs talking like that in the last battle. When you hear the beavers talking in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you are not at all hearing Lewis's imagination of what it would be like if beavers could actually talk, right? You are not learning anything about, like, the beaver experience, what it's like to be a beaver. I mean, there are like slight elements of it, like his humility about the beautiful dam that he's built and stuff like that. But even that is attributing human emotions onto a beaver rather than really trying to capture beaver emotions and beaver experience, like we get with the horses in The Horse and His Boy, like we get with the dogs in the last battle, and in other places. I mean, it's something you can see growing. But in any case, So yeah, I don't think, as far as consistency goes, it's a consistency. It's an inconsistency of imagination, and you just have to redo The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe completely. And so I wouldn't want to see anyone try it, because it's you'd have to chuck out most of it. And you could keep the shape, you could keep the overall plot, but you'd have to throw out a lot of it, including a bunch of the characters. I mean, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, as we know them from the text, would be totally gone if we were trying to do that. Sarah is bringing up Sarah Detweiler on YouTube is bringing up the Badger Truffle Hunter in Prince Caspian, and that I think Sarah Truffle Hunter is a really great transitional. You can see him as transitional. On the one hand, he's more badgery. There's more of the badger element. I am a badger, and because I'm a badger, I think and feel certain ways, right? And yet again, it's not exactly like I am giving voice to what is a perceptible badger trait, right? He's still mostly anthropomorphized, even though his animal status is more. So I think he's a transitional figure between Mr. and Mrs. Beaver on the one hand, and Bree and Wynn on the other hand, right? On the other end. So yeah, he acknowledges his badgerness, right? His badgeriness, but he doesn't. But again, I don't think necessarily the wild badgers would necessarily act like that. Would necessarily be like that. Whereas dogs absolutely do act like the dogs in The Last Battle. The bears also. The bears are transitional as well. Yeah, Sarah, I agree. In Prince Caspian, again, this is why the inconsistencies in Narnia can be delightful if you just let them happen. You just roll with them.
Don't
right?
overthink it.
And they're gradual. They're gradual enough that it's the water slowly heating up, and you can't tell. You can't tell when it's boiling, right? I mean, it's so it doesn't feel violent. But man, when you reorder them and shift them around, all of a sudden, it's very weird. Does violence all over the place. Anyway, didn't mean to launch into a lecture as to why you should read them in publication order, but there it is. So it just came up again to me because they released the new covers. There's a new set of illustrated covers for the series, and it triggered me with the order again.
They did it in chronological.
They always do now. I mean, that's standard. It's been standard for ever so long.
Not a fan.
No. I love the fact that a lot of people will be like, C.S. Lewis approved of it, and I'm like, well, more fool he. That's, I mean, and I'd say it to his face. I think
we're not saying we're right, he's wrong. We're saying we prefer.
I'm saying. Well, no, I am saying I'm right and he's wrong.
Yeah, that's true. I'm you're more likely to do that. I do wonder. I'm so impressionable of whatever I read is what I know. So if I had read them in chronological first, I wonder if I would have felt that this was fine.
Yeah.
But because I read them so many times.
Yes.
In the other way, it's just always going to be wrong because that's what my brain does.
Yeah, and I can't deny. I mean, look, it's. I'm not saying anyone who has come to know them and love them in chronological order is wrong, right? I'm just saying that
you'll never agree with them. That's all.
Well, that's certainly true. And I think that they would enjoy them more if they read them in publication order. That's all. I think there are reasons why they would.
So obviously we're scraping the surface here.
Yeah, there's a lot more to talk about. It would be fun to look at some of the later Narnias as well.
It's been a long time since I've done Caspian and Dawn Treader. That might be kind of fun, especially because we do have two versions of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You could do a little mini series if you want to do Caspian next.
Yeah, let's choose. We don't have to do openings. I was excited to do openings for this because I remember when I first saw the Walden one in the theaters, I was so struck by that opening.
You want to do Caspian or we should do Caspian.
Let's do Caspian.
There's more I want to talk about in Dawn Treader, but I think for the sake of doing it in order.
Let's do the scene. I want to choose a scene. Can we choose a scene?
Yeah.
Let's do the scene where Knickerbrick and the hag and the werewolf try to conjure up the White Witch.
Ooh. Okay. I'm writing this down if you can hear my typing. I have to rewatch it. I don't know it well enough.
Yeah. So yep, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that.
Okay.
Scene. I think
We're not here next week.
We're not here next week. I'm going to be in Florida next week. But yeah, let's look at that scene. Look at the choices that are being made, both in the let's look at the text. Let's look at the BBC version. Let's look at the Walden version.
Okay.
Yeah.
March 3rd.
March 3rd.
We'll be back with Prince Caspian.
That's the plan.
Go team.
All right. Very good.
Thanks for the recommendation, James. Good one.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah. Appreciate that, James. All right. Well, we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. Bye now.
Guys.